The year 1906 marked one of the darkest chapters in industrial history. Deep beneath the coal-rich fields of northern France, in a region called Pas-de-Calais, lay an enormous network of underground tunnels where thousands of men descended each day to fuel the engines of a growing nation. The Courrières coal mines were among the most productive in all of Europe, generating wealth for shareholders and supplying energy to factories, homes, and railways across the continent. But beneath that prosperity lay a dangerous and fragile world. A world where men breathed coal dust instead of fresh air, where the earth could shake without warning, and where a single spark could ignite catastrophe. On March 10th, 1906, that catastrophe arrived. In a matter of minutes, an explosion of almost incomprehensible force tore through more than 110 kilometers of underground tunnels. Gas, fire, and collapsing rock engulfed the miners before they had any chance to escape. Over 1,099 men and boys, some as young as 13, lost their lives in what became the worst mining disaster in European history. This is their story. To understand the scale of the Courrières disaster, one must first understand the world that created it. By the early 20th century, the Compagnie des Mines de Courrières had grown into one of the most powerful industrial enterprises in France. The company operated a sprawling network of mines across the Pas-de-Calais coalfield, employing tens of thousands of workers and extracting millions of tons of coal each year. The region had been transformed almost entirely by mining. Towns like Billy-Montigny, Méricourt, and Salomines existed almost solely to serve the mines. Rows of identical brick houses, called corons, stretched across the flat northern landscape, home to miners and their families who had often worked the coal seams for generations. The mines were deep, dangerous, and indispensable. Coal was the lifeblood of industrial France, and the Courrières Company sat at the center of that lifeblood. Management focused relentlessly on productivity, profit, and output. Safety measures existed on paper, but enforcement was inconsistent, and the men who worked underground knew that they were always gambling with their lives. The ground itself was their workplace, their prison, and sometimes their grave. Mining in the early 1900s was an industry that lived alongside constant danger, and no threat was more feared than the invisible gases lurking within coal seams. Fire damp, a mixture of methane and other flammable gases, accumulated naturally in the spaces between coal and rock, waiting silently for an ignition source. Experienced miners could sometimes detect it by the faint hiss it made escaping through cracks, or by the way a candle flame stretched and lengthened near a pocket of gas. But detection was far from reliable, and a pocket of fire damp discovered too late could end lives in an instant. Alongside fire damp, coal dust presented an equally terrifying but less understood hazard. When disturbed, fine coal particles suspended in the air could ignite with explosive force, turning entire tunnels into channels of fire. In the years leading up to 1906, European mining engineers had begun to recognize that coal dust explosions could travel enormous distances underground, far beyond the original ignition point. However, this knowledge had not yet translated into widespread safety reforms at Courrières. The tunnels were dry, the dust was thick, and ventilation was far from adequate. The conditions underground at Courrières were not. The morning shift at the Courrières mine began like any other. In the pre-dawn darkness, thousands of men and boys gathered at the pithead, their breath forming small clouds in the cold northern air. They wore heavy work clothes and carried their lamps, some still using open flame rather than the safer enclosed designs that had been introduced elsewhere. Families said their goodbyes with the quiet resignation of people who had grown accustomed to the risk. Mothers watched their husbands and sons disappear into the cage that would lower them hundreds of meters below the surface. At approximately 6:34 in the morning, the Earth moved. A massive explosion, later estimated to have been equivalent to the detonation of several tons of dynamite, erupted somewhere deep in the pit. The force of the blast traveled at devastating speed through the interconnected tunnels, feeding on the thick coal dust that lined every surface. Within seconds, the explosion had become something far larger than any single gas pocket could have produced. It had become a chain reaction, a rolling inferno that consumed tunnel after tunnel in rapid succession. Those near the epicenter had no chance. The men working in the tunnels closest to the initial blast were killed almost instantly by the pressure wave alone. When the explosion ripped through the mine, its effects were felt immediately above ground. The pithead structures shook violently. Managed to reach the surface emerged covered in soot, their clothes torn, many of them bleeding, barely able to speak. They stumbled into the cold air with hollow, distant eyes. Men who had witnessed something their minds could not yet fully process. Within minutes, the village of Méricourt was overtaken by panic. Women ran toward the mine, screaming the names of their husbands and sons. Children followed without understanding why their mothers were weeping. The streets filled with people, and the crowd grew rapidly as word spread through the Courrières houses, along the alleyways and across the flat northern fields. Company officials arrived at the scene uncertain and unprepared. The scale of what had happened was difficult to grasp. Dozens of shafts needed to be assessed. Rescuers tried to descend, but were forced back by toxic gases. The mine was still burning in places, and fresh explosions remained a threat. No one on the surface knew for certain how many men were trapped below, or in which sections of the vast tunnel network they might still be alive. As the hours passed, organized rescue operations began to take shape. Though organized is perhaps too generous a word for what unfolded in the first days after the explosion. Local miners volunteered by the hundreds, desperate to reach their colleagues and family members. Rescue teams entered the tunnels wearing primitive breathing apparatus, equipment that was unreliable at best and fatal at worst. The air underground was thick with afterdamp, the deadly mixture of gases produced after an explosion, chief among them carbon monoxide. Even short exposure to afterdamp could render a man unconscious within minutes. Several rescuers died in the attempt. International assistance arrived quickly. German mining rescue experts, who had developed more advanced equipment and techniques following disasters in the Ruhr coal fields, were among the first foreign teams to arrive. Their presence was both a practical aid and a source of national pride that cut both ways for the French authorities. The public was desperate for news, for names, for any sign that the missing men were still alive. Newspapers printed lists of the dead and missing, and those lists grew longer with each edition. The company made public statements about the progress of rescue efforts, statements that often diverged sharply from the grim reality underground. Hope was desperately needed, and it was in desperately short supply. While rescue teams struggled above and below ground, a small number of men were fighting their own desperate battle for survival deep within the ruined mine. Some workers had been spared from the initial blast simply by the accident of their location, tucked into a side tunnel or behind a natural barrier of rock that deflected the worst of the shockwave. These men now faced a new set of challenges: dwindling air, no light, no food, no water, and no way of knowing whether anyone was coming to save them. In the darkness, the survivors huddled together. Some prayed, others tried to organize their small group and preserve their strength. They listened for sounds of drilling from above, for any indication that the surface world had not forgotten them. Days passed, The men who survived did so through extraordinary physical resilience and, in many cases, a refusal to accept despair. Some survivors drank underground water that seeped through the rock, water that was potentially contaminated but kept them alive. Others found compressed air pockets that sustained their breathing. 20 days after the explosion, an almost unimaginable length of time, rescuers broke through a blocked passage and found 13 men still alive. Their survival stunned the world. These men had endured in conditions that defy comprehension, holding on to life by the barest of... The Courrières disaster did not unfold in a political vacuum. France in 1906 was a nation in transition, marked by tensions between labor and capital, between socialist reformers and conservative industrial interests, and between a government that needed both coal and calm. From the moment the news of the explosion spread, the political dimensions of the tragedy were impossible to ignore. Workers in the region were already organized and militant. Strikes had been a regular feature of industrial life in the northern coal fields, and the union movement was growing in confidence and membership. When it became clear that the mine management had been warned about dangerous gas concentrations in the weeks before the explosion and had failed to act, the anger of the surviving workers and their families became explosive in its own way. Strikes broke out almost immediately after the disaster. Thousands of miners across the Pas-de-Calais region walked off the job, demanding safer conditions, accountability from the company, and compensation for the families of the dead. The strikes attracted national attention, including that of a young and ambitious politician named Georges Clemenceau, who would later serve as Prime Minister of France. Clemenceau sent troops to the region, a decision that deepened the bitterness between the government and the mining communities. In the weeks that followed the explosion, the communities around Courrières were consumed by grief on a scale that is almost impossible to imagine. Over 1,000 funerals, hundreds of widows, children who would grow up without fathers. The flat landscape of Pas-de-Calais, already grey under the northern sky, seemed to take on a deeper shade of mourning. The funerals were held continuously, sometimes dozens on a single day, in the small churches and cemeteries that dotted the region. Coffins were carried through the streets on carts and shoulders. The faces of the bereaved, women in black, children clutching their mothers' hands, old men who had worked the mines themselves and now buried their sons, became the visual record of the disaster. Journalists and photographers from across France descended on the region, and their images spread throughout the country and beyond. The public was confronted with the human cost of industrial prosperity in a way it had not been before. This was not an abstract statistic. It was a woman weeping at a graveside, a child too young to understand why his father was not coming home, a community emptied of an entire generation of men. As the weeks became months, hope faded for most, leaving only the heavy weight of permanent loss. As the rescue operations wound down and the immediate emergency passed, the question of responsibility came to the fore. What had caused the explosion? Who was to blame? And would anyone be held accountable? The official investigation pointed to a convergence of factors, an accumulation of fire damp ignited by a source that was never definitively identified, which triggered a massive coal dust explosion that spread through the entire tunnel network. The investigation also found evidence of systemic failures. Ventilation in the mine had been inadequate. Warning signs of dangerous gas concentrations had been reported and not acted upon. Safety regulations existed, but were not consistently enforced. The company had prioritized production over the safety of its workers, and that was perhaps the most damning finding of all. Despite this, no individual at Courrières faced criminal prosecution. The company paid compensation to the families of the victims, but the amounts were widely regarded as insufficient. The management was not imprisoned. The shareholders continued to collect dividends. For many in the labor movement, the outcome confirmed what they had long suspected, that the lives of working men were valued less than the coal they extracted, and that the industrial system was fundamentally indifferent to their deaths. Despite the failure of the justice system to hold individuals accountable, the Courrières disaster had a lasting impact on mining safety and labor rights in France and across Europe. The sheer magnitude of the loss made it impossible for governments to simply return to business as usual. In France, the disaster accelerated the development of new mining safety laws. Requirements for better ventilation systems, more reliable gas detection equipment, and improved rescue protocols were introduced in the years following 1906. The disaster also gave momentum to the French labor movement, strengthening the hand of unions and contributing to a broader public conversation about the rights of workers. Internationally, the Courrières disaster contributed to a growing movement for mining safety reform. In the United Kingdom, Germany, and the United States, regulators and engineers looked at the French disaster as a case study in what could go wrong when safety was treated as secondary to profit. The disaster at Monongah, West Virginia, which killed over 360 miners just months later, and the Sengenid disaster in Wales in 1913, together with Courrières, formed a grim catalogue of industrial catastrophe that eventually forced governments to take the safety of underground workers far more seriously. The sacrifice of those who died was not entirely in vain. More than a century after the explosion of March 10, 1906, the Courrières disaster remains a defining moment in the history of industrial France. It is remembered in the towns and villages of Pas-de-Calais through memorials, museums, and annual commemorations that gather the descendants of the victims alongside local officials and members of the public. In Billy-Montigny and Méricourt, the disaster is woven into the community's identity. For these communities, the memory of Courrières is not merely historical. It is personal, familial, and alive. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren carry the names of men they never met, and they gather each year to ensure that those men are not forgotten. The disaster has also taken its place in the broader history of labor rights and industrial safety, a moment when the invisible cost of industrial progress became, briefly and painfully, visible to the entire world. The legacy of Courrières is not only about the men who died, it is about the systems that failed them, the reforms that their deaths helped bring about, and the continuing struggle to ensure that workers in dangerous industries are protected by law, by technology, and by a society that refuses to treat human life as simply another cost of doing business. The 1,099 men and boys who perished beneath the fields of northern France deserve to be remembered.